Welcome to Newswatch. Westminster has been awash this week with resignations, plots and gossip. Too much gossip for one viewer, Patrick Moore, who wrote to us, "I'm becoming heartily sick of the rumour, gossip, speculation and opinion that now masquerades as the news, and increasingly, I'm sad to say, on the BBC." While Gary Howes asked about the BBC's political coverage, why is it that news reporters are looking and sounding more and more like drunken thugs whooping up a roadside brawl? Such has been the febrile political atmosphere over the past few weeks that at times the campaigns for Thursday's European elections and local elections in England seemed completely overshadowed. In particular, some Newswatch viewers have objected to how much we've heard about and from the smaller parties who were widely predicted to have done better than normal in this week's polls. Richard Allen felt that the British National Party was underrepresented, writing, "Is there any hope to hear anything other than politically correct material on the BBC? I'm a liberal individual, but over years of neglecting the truth, the BBC has led me to voting BNP in the European elections. And I can tell you that I am definitely not the only one." But John Kilbride disagreed, arguing the BBC should not allow itself to be a mouthpiece for these noxious individuals masquerading as a legitimate party. While open debate and discussion is important, uncritical coverage of the BNP only encourages the violent racists and xenophobes who lurk in their shadows. Well, to discuss how the BBC allocates the time it gives to the various parties during election campaigns, I'm joined by Rick Bailey, the BBC's chief political advisor. Rick Bailey, first of all, the BNP point. To one viewer, they're noxious individuals who shouldn't be encouraged. To others, underrepresented in the BBC's coverage. How do you square that particular circle?
This is where questions about impartiality are absolutely central. The BNP is a legitimate political party. It's registered with the Electoral Commission. It's within the law. The BBC, which is an impartial organisation, has to treat all parties consistently.
So you can't ignore them even if you wanted to do so?
We certainly can't ignore them, and we have to give them coverage which is appropriate to their size. So they're not one of the largest parties, but on the other hand, they have significant evidence of electoral support in certain parts of the country. They came quite close to winning a seat in the European Parliament last time, and so when we're deciding what levels of coverage we give to different parties, we look at the BNP in the same way as we look at any other party, and that means they get some coverage, and it means they also get appropriate scrutiny.
But we're in a new situation here where essentially you're dealing with a system created for a three-party system, and now there are many other parties who may actually be doing well in the run-up to the next general election, certainly much better than before. Veritas, the jury team. How do you cope with this fragmentation of politics, which is clearly going on at the moment?
I don't think that's anything new. We don't have a three-party system in Scotland and Wales, or Northern Ireland for that matter. We have four-party systems there, and there's some overlap between them. So we already have a very complicated pattern of political structures that in our UK coverage we have to wrestle with some quite difficult situations in order to make sure we're properly impartial. A lot of the smaller parties are very new, and they don't have evidence of electoral support. They don't have that much evidence of support in the opinion polls. But if you look at the example of UKIP, that was where they were some years ago. They have got more support by demonstrating that they have got electoral support, and that's the right place to start, where real voters count.
This is an unprecedented time for polling day where you could actually get quite dramatic and damaging stories coming out to hit the electoral prospects of one party. What are the guidelines for coverage actually at the last minute of the campaigns?
We've never really had an equivalent election campaign where so much has been happening on such a scale on a cross-party basis. And so that has to a certain extent dominated the coverage, and that's had an effect on the coverage of the European elections. But we can keep those things separate. So long as they're not to do with the European elections, we can cover them in the normal way and give coverage appropriately. But we do have to fence off, if you like, in some circumstances, the election coverage and make sure that that element of it is giving different parties an appropriate voice.
If this instability continues in the run-up to a general election campaign, does this mean you're going to have to rethink how you do things?
We do guidelines for each and every election, taking into account the context of that election. So we don't just have one set of guidelines that applies to every election. So as we go towards the general election, We will take account of what's happened at this election, and if there is evidence about support moving from the bigger parties and lots of smaller parties, that's something we'll have to think about in terms of how we do our coverage. But we need the evidence to look at. We can't just treat one party in a particular way differently to other parties of a similar size.
Rick Bailey, thank you very much indeed. Now, although we won't know the results of the elections for the European Parliament until Sunday, Newswatch viewers have already been giving their verdict on the BBC's treatment of the campaign. Yvonne Taylor wrote to us last weekend saying, "We need more information on the European elections. Every interview with politicians is about MPs' expenses. This election is important, so please give us the information we need to make an informed choice, not a reactionary one." And what about BBC News' coverage of Europe outside of election time? For many viewers, there just isn't enough of it. Justin Greer-Spencer writes, "I just think we should be good Europeans like the French and Germans, who are more than happy to criticise aspects of the system and laws of the EU, just as they are those of their own governments. Let's join in. This is a democracy. Let us have as frank a look at the upper layer of government in Brussels and Strasbourg as we do at our own regional parliament in Westminster." Another viewer, Richard White, has similar concerns. Here's his report.
I've come to Brussels, a place where lots of important decisions are made, which have a direct effect on how we live our lives in the UK. I don't think the BBC tells us enough about Europe, and I'm here to find out why.
I think you're right to have a concern, but there is a real challenge here because the EU is quite a complicated decision-making body. We've got the Parliament, we've got the European Commission, this building behind us, the civil service arm, we've got the government arm, the Council of Ministers, and I think one of the difficulties for viewers and listeners is that they don't quite understand what these institutions do. So you have a big job to do to explain it. The other problem, particularly for television, is this isn't a great picture story.
It's true that we've had a fair bit of coverage of the European Union in the run-up to this week's elections.
Vote UKIP, June the 4th.
But when the pollsters have gone home and the election results are declared, I fear that coverage will return to the dark recesses of the BBC. The BBC does have some excellent offerings, such as the Weekly Digest, the Record Europe, shown on the News Channel and the Parliament Channel, and also Mark Mardell's blog on the internet. But I'd like to see more coverage of Europe on the main TV channels.
It would be nice to see a bit more coverage of European affairs when there isn't some major crisis going on, whether it's institutional or whether it's over the budget or whatever, because we do deal with important issues here in Brussels. I would say in Britain you tend to find people don't know very many foreign politicians, if you want to put it that way. I mean, they know who Angela Merkel is and maybe Berlusconi and Sarkozy. But I do get the impression that in Britain people think the EU is about Germany and France, and it's not. I mean, it's a much bigger thing than that.
There's no shortage of interesting and important stories about Europe in our newspapers. Take these that I found. European foreign ministers are pressurising Ireland into holding another referendum on the Lisbon Treaty this year, despite already having said no last year. 18 new MEPs are to be elected this week, who will be on full salaries and expenses, even though they may not start work for 4 years. And President Sarkozy of France has suggested that Tony Blair become President of the EU when the Lisbon Treaty is ratified. I can't find any evidence that any of these stories were covered on BBC One news bulletins. Why not?
If the reaction of the crowd in Almere, near Amsterdam, is anything to go by, he's pretty popular.
Mark Mardell was appointed as the BBC's first Europe editor 4 years ago. Does he feel there's a problem here?
I think the answer is it's in competition with an awful lot of other stuff. The question is, and I would love to get more on than I do, is what do you drop? What do you drop from that relatively short 10 o'clock news bulletin? I think there's also something about the nature of the European story. I mean, I think if you couldn't design a better anti-story than the EU. It's about consensus. It's not about drama. A lot of the figures in the EU, in the Commission, are not particularly colourful, and they don't want to be particularly colourful. There isn't that clash that you get at Westminster. I think also, let you into a secret, that I think that it's not necessarily that viewers, are fascinated by Westminster politics and American politics and bored by European politics. That's the editors and the politicians. And the political classes don't rate Europe as a story, including the top politicians. They don't think it's that although they realise its importance, they realise it's not that sexy.
No.
I've noticed that you've just been editing a piece. You're working on a piece from, I think it's Geert Wilders, the extreme Dutch MP who was refused entry to the UK. Do you think this is typical of the coverage of Europe?
If you're saying, does there have to be a British connection? I think it makes it more interesting for viewers. I mean, that's not the reason that we're actually doing Wilders, but it makes it more interesting. And also the editors have heard of him. Oh, that was the chap who was banned from Britain. Rather than I have to start from the beginning and explain who somebody is. There's an immediate connection there.
People will not take an interest in Europe until it becomes a part of their consciousness. The UK has been a political part of Europe for over 30 years, and EU-inspired legislation has a huge effect on each of our everyday lives. I believe that the BBC should lend equal weight to news and speculation from Brussels as it does to that from Westminster. If this means devoting a little more time to news coverage at the expense of lightweight magazine programmes, then I, for one, am in favour.
Viewer Richard White there. Many thanks for all your views this week. If you have a comment to make about BBC News or current affairs, you can call us on 0370 010 6676 or email newswatch@bbc.co.uk. Thanks for watching. You could be making our news next week.